In a sense, Claymont and Blakely are twin houses. They were built by two brothers who married a pair of sisters, and they were built at the same time. And they were built on different sections of the same property. Some 2,500 acres owned by the general's brother John Augustine Washington in the present Jefferson County. He called Prospect Hill, and there was a little house on it from the early days, where perhaps he stayed if he came up here for an occasional visit or attempts to lease out some of the land and earn enough money to pay the taxes on it, or just to make sure that the land was still there. This property went to his second son, Corbin Washington, when John Augustine died. The General Washington, his Corbin's uncle, advised him to settle and live up here, but Corbin's wife, Hannah Lee, wanted to stay with her brothers and sisters, who were all settling in and around Alexandria and Fairfax County. And so that's where Corbin built a house and settled. Corbin and Hannah soon died of tuberculosis, and this 2,500 acres was left to Corbin's three sons. The oldest son, Richard Henry Lee Washington, was a bachelor and died at an early age of tuberculosis. And his third of the 2,500 acres went to his two surviving brothers and to his sister, Mrs. Herbert. The two brothers, when they came of age about 1810, did settle up here and build a pair of houses facing each other across the creek, across the stream, which they called Blakely and Claymont. The younger brother, Bushrod Corbin, built a large, magnificent mansion at Claymont, which for many, many years, generations, was the largest residence ever built in West Virginia. His older brother, John Augustine, built a more modest house at Blakely because, as the older brother, he was to inherit Mount Vernon from their uncle, Judge Bushrod Washington, who was childless, and as indeed John Augustine did inherit it. Here the two families lived in close relation with each other, especially since the two men, John Augustine and Bushrod Corbin, who built Blakely and Claymont, had married two Blackburn sisters. Claymont, the large house, had a disastrous fire around 1840, but was rebuilt. And Bushrod Corbin continued to live there. He and his Blackburn wife only had two children, born a year apart, very soon after they were married. And they were a daughter and a son. The daughter eloped, I believe, from a visit at Mount Vernon with a Mr. Alexander, of whom the family did not approve at all. It's believed that he was a widower. He was a good deal older than she, and turned out to be such an unfortunate marriage that after 9 children, they were ultimately divorced in 1854. And he went off to Alexandria and married a 3rd time. The son of Bushrod Washington, the builder of Claymont, Thomas Blackburn Washington, lived there from 1812 until his death in 1854. His mother had died in the 30s, and his father died, I think, around 1847. And he had a good-sized family of 9 children. I say they had these large families, but an awful lot of these children died in infancy or early childhood. However, there were sufficient number of survivors that there were always lots of people around. Hannah and Mr. Alexander lived for a while at the house Corbin had built in Fairfax County for Hannah Lee, called Selby. Then they came up here to Jefferson County and lived at Claymont with her father. And his second wife, a lady from Leesburg. Eventually, in the 1840s and 50s, the Claymont farm of some 1,200 acres was cut up and other houses were built on it. There was one called Braddock. Must have been built, I believe, in the 1840s, as I recall. And the 2 children of Bushrod Washington, Mrs. Alexander and Thomas Blackburn Washington, it's hard for me in the records to follow when each lived at Claymont and when they lived at one of these other houses on the Claymont property. I just haven't studied it enough to remember all the details. But they were living in different houses on the same original 1,200 acres. When the Civil War came along, Thomas Blackburn Washington had died. He'd been on some sort of a trip up to Albany, New York, of all places, where he caught, I don't know, I can't remember whether it was typhoid fever or cholera or what, and died up there, strangely. His father had died, but his widow, who'd been Rebecca Janet Cunningham from across the river in Maryland, was living there at Claymont with her children, and Hannah was living there, at least a good deal of the time, until 1854, when finally her Mr. Alexander departed. So as the war approached, the family was essentially 2 women and a whole bunch of children. I'm trying to think what the oldest of them was. I guess the oldest of the Alexanders was born in the mid-1830s, and the oldest of the Washingtons in 1839, certainly. And so there were several boys of fighting age, of Army age, when the war broke out. About that time, about the beginning of the war, Rebecca Janet Cunningham took off. That is, she married a second time. She married a widower, a Mr. Sile from Maryland, who'd previously been married to one of her cousins over there. He was a minister and took her, of all places, to Japan, where he was a missionary. And she took along her youngest child, a daughter who'd been born 2 months after her Washington husband died. So this left her, Rebecca's and Thomas's sons there at Claymont. And they were Bushrod and Thomas, naturally the same names recurring. And Bushrod, born in 1839, was just ripe for the Army. Thomas was too young. He was a good deal younger. And then Hannah had a daughter there, and she had a couple of surviving sons out of her numerous family. Maybe there were 3 or 4 of them. So this was a family that suffered a good deal in the war. Now my memory's coming back. Actually, when Rebecca went to Japan, she left 4 Washington sons there at Claymont: Bushrod, George, Jimmy, and Thomas. And Hannah Alexander had, she had a son Thomas, a son William, a son Herbert, and a son Richard. And so each of these 2 women had 4 sons, and each of them lost 2 sons in the war. Of the Washington sons, the oldest one, Bushrod Corbin Washington, named for his grandfather, had served throughout the war and is written up in Baylor's, From Bull Run to Bull Run, whatever the book is. He was left-handed, and there's some interesting story about his getting into a sword fight with a Yankee officer whom he completely defeated because the officer had never been taught to deal with a left-handed swordsman. Few people were, I guess. He married Emma Allen from this house was called Weehaw on the Clark County, Jefferson County line on the road from on the old road from Charlestown to Berryville, where Bill Leedy lives now, and had to run. He had to come through, steal his way through Yankee lines to get there to have his wedding, which was an evening wedding, I believe.